Well, anyway, I'm actually watching you sip, Isabelle. I'm getting thirsty, but if I start now, then I'll be out by noon our time. So. But anyway, it is now the witching hour here, 9:01. So let's get Wine Fair Day 2 started. I'm Pamela Bush, the founder of Wine Fair and the Vanguard, and thank you everybody for joining us. So we are kicking off the weekend with this panel on tasting natural wine with the pros. Samantha Brown is the moderator, and Samantha is one of the Vanguard Advisory Board members. She is a social justice educator and a wine drinker. Thinking about all the great things I want to say about you, but yeah. So Samantha and I are actually both in a graduate program together. That's how we know each other. And having her on the Vanguard Advisory Board with her just vast experience and knowledge of social justice education has been a blessing for the organization. So Samantha, I'm going to let you take it away. Everybody else, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to watch, but I am putting myself off the screen.
Thank you, Pamela. Yeah, I was like, don't say too much pressure. But thank you, Pamela, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is really exciting. I remember when I first met Pamela, and I think it was 2017, and she was getting ready for the first wine fair, which was in person in San Francisco. And she was rallying volunteers from our graduate program. We were like, wine fair, what's that? And so I believe that, this year, because of all the transition that we've had and, Pamela's dedication to Vanguard and making sure that, she does the work of social justice and equity and inclusion through her work and her experience in this industry, that a lot less folks will be asking, what is wine fair? Because so many will now know what wine fair is, what the Vanguard is, and what she's striving to do through her work. So thank you, Pamela, for including me as a consumer. And I'm really excited today to welcome our panelists. I want to thank first our sponsor, T. Edward Wines from New York, who's a wine and spirit distributor, for giving us the resources and supporting us as we take on this wonderful topic of tasting natural wine with the pros. Because as a consumer, I asked Pamela, like, what is natural wine? I go in the store, I'm like, yeah, there's some natural wine over there, but what does that mean? What am I looking for? What are all the things that are being talked about when it comes to natural wine? And so I'm really excited for our experts to get on here and just vibe with each other and have a great conversation about the natural wine movement, about how consumers and industry partners can really be a part of this, and so much more. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in. And I'm going to give my wonderful panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, because no one can do it better. So I am going to go in order of who I see on my screen. And next to me, I see Isabelle. So I'm going to ask Isabelle to go first. And for those of you who are not speaking, just please mute yourself so we don't get any feedback while the others are speaking.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening for me here. You'll probably see the light drawing to a close. I'm based in England. I'm originally from France. I was brought up in Cognac on a very small farm, and actually all my family and for generations we've been grape farmers. So my childhood has been very much helping on the farm. We had a very, I would say, biodiverse farm. We grew everything we ate, and we also kept animals. And as I grew up, I was born in 1972, and as I grew up, I saw my family's farms from the mid-80s onwards become, a non-organic farm. My father started introducing, artificial fertilizers, weed killers, bringing in the harvest machine, whereas before we had a really vibrant team of vendangeurs at home. And then, slowly, what happened on our farm is really a reflection of what happened in Europe, I think, in the mid-80s onwards. I left home and I studied, ended up in London. I lost my dad when I was 28. He died of lung cancer, which I think is related to what, the way he was farming without any protection and using a lot of products. And that really started, in a way, my wine career, because I was 28 at the time, and I decided that it was time that maybe I took an interest into, how I was brought up, and the wine culture I was brought up in. And at the time when I started my wine studies, I didn't know a Chablis was a Chardonnay. I mean, I knew zero about wine. I knew how to make wine from Uni Blanc, but I had no wine culture. So I attended the WSET in London, and then I did the Master of Wine. And throughout my studies, I realized that the thing that I really wanted, I was really longing for, which was the farming and being with people, with, dirt on their hands, wasn't really happening, and that the wine industry is actually like any other industry. And so I became quite disillusioned. The more I sort of got to know about the wine industry, the more I kind of, realized it wasn't really for me. And then I came across, the usual suspects and texts by Nicolas Joly and key wines, and realized that actually there was a small pocket of the wine industry that really spoke to me. And then throughout midway through my MW studies, my Master of Wine studies, I decided actually really natural wine was the thing that where I belonged and really resonated with me. And as soon as I became an MW, a lot of people said I committed career suicide at the time, because I suddenly had, so many, I would say, glamorous job offers. I just said, no, I just need to do the thing that I really want to do. And that was, some 15, 16 years ago. And then, I wrote a book called Natural Wine. I created I would say an online community that's called Raw Wine, where we now organize, organize events. Well, I used to organize events. I don't really know what's going to happen next, but so I created Raw Wine, which is a gathering of growers, and we organize this in many places, I would say, around the world. And that's me.
And what is that book called, Isabelle?
It's
I love how she mentions a book.
I've even got it here with me. I wrote this in 2014, so it's but I'm on the 3rd edition now. Yeah, more later.
Thank you. Audrey, you're on.
Right. Hello. I'm Audrey. I'm a sommelier at a small modern British restaurant in London called Lawn. And I'm a diploma in wine student actually as well. But my journey into wine was slightly a convoluted one. And don't hate me when I say this, but I started off mainly as a beer drinker. I'm a massive beer enthusiast. But at the time, there was a massive explosion of craft brewing in London, and there was some experimentation with all of these like wild yeast fermented beers that may have incorporated like different wine yeasts in their making. Some of them had been aged in wine barrels. So I saw this crossover and was like, oh, I would love to be a part of this. So I went and started working at a place where I was a head of wine and beer. And there I kind of met the woman who would usher me more towards kind of the enjoyment of natural wines. And her name was Albert. So we went to a lot of tastings, tasted widely. I guess because I started off drinking beer, my taste was quite broad. My expectation of what a wine is and can be is like massive. So I got into natural wines or enjoying natural wines that way. But then I started pursuing my Western studies, and it's more kind of, you taste a lot of conventional wines, you learn about kind of structure, conventions of tasting. So it's a broad church with me. And then I decided to become a sommelier, and that is where I am now, continuing to explore, enjoying all wines, but I guess that a lot more low intervention wines are interesting and exciting, and yeah, more on that later.
Dinkinish. And mute.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dinkinish. Feel free to call me Dink. I'm based in Miami, Florida, and I consider myself a wine storyteller, a wine writer. I'm someone who has always been very interested in the story that precedes the bottle and the story that happens after the bottle, which is us, what we bring, our memories and our experiences. As I was listening to Audrey and Isabelle, I thought, wow, what I have in common with these women is this sense of wine and home. Like Isabelle was talking about how she went back to her roots to form her relationship with wine, right? And I thought about my journey and how for me it was extremely important as a young wine writer to be able to tell the wine story in a way that resonated with me. So I'm from Miami, which means that I grew up around Cubans and Haitians and Bahamians and Jamaicans and Venezuelans. So a lot of what I write, those themes will be in the story, in the description. Like I might describe the street side barbecue smoke of a, Pinot Noir from South Africa. I might write about Jamaican oxtail notes in a wine from Slovenia, for example. So I'm very much on the romantic side of wine storytelling and also consciousness. And the reason why I'm really happy to be here is because I've written a few stories about racism in the wine industry. And my hope, I transitioned into natural wine, I would say in the last 3 years. And I've been tasting wine professionally for about 20 years. And what my hope is on this journey, and even in this conversation, is how can natural wine culture be the progression of the natural progression of something that has been very unnatural in the industry. This idea of alienating palates and making people feel insecure and like unworthy, like your palate is not worthy, your palate is not a part of the community of wine drinkers, if that makes sense to everyone. So thank you for allowing me to be in this space.
Absolutely. And I think that makes perfect sense as of a consumer. So one of the things that I have been, as I've been listening to the panels the last day, there are lots of experts here and lots of folks who know what they speak, that have been a part of, I guess, quote unquote, wine culture for a long time. And so some of us, though, are new, and some of us are still exploring that palette. And so one thing that kept coming up for me was this idea of, natural versus conventional wine, right, and taste. And so someone said, one of the makers said, well, I really, I like natural wine, but I actually want my natural wine to taste like conventional wine. And in my head, I was thinking, what does that mean? It's wine. And so I want you all to just kind of, introduce us to natural wine. What is this? What is natural wine versus conventional wine? And what are the things that differentiates it for you? And also share, your taste. Like, what do you prefer it to be like? What do you hope that others take away from that tasting? And in any order, you all are free to.
So what I wanted to say, you just made a comment about somebody saying that they wanted their natural wine to taste like conventional wine. So when you're I'll speak for myself. When I was transitioning into natural wine, it wasn't love at first sight with my palate. Those sour cherry notes were very unfamiliar to me. I couldn't make the distinction between, is this wine flawed? Is this a vinegar note? Like what's going, it was very new. And I came up, learning about wine that has structure, typicity. When you smell a wine, it should smell like this. The natural wine culture, you have to kind of surrender to the grape and surrender to the earth and ultimately surrender your ego quite a bit, because you may taste a natural wine by a producer, one vintage, and it tastes one way, and then you taste it the next and it's totally different. If you're a conventional wine drinker, that might irritate you quite a bit because there's a level of uniformity in many conventional wines from vintage to vintage. Not always, but a lot of the times. With natural wine, you need to be able to go with the flow and allow the experience to take your palate into some place that you may be unfamiliar with.
No, what you said really resonated, that it wasn't an instantaneous love story. And I think people need to be prepared for there to be not even like a shock, but if you drink, like if you like sour beers or you like kind of earthier ales, some natural wines will be right up your street. But the idea is that natural is not, it's not a style, it's more of a philosophy, and therefore how wines will present themselves is very different. And I think if you are someone who has drank mainly like what you would refer to as conventional wines, and especially if you're studying, it's so structured, and it's very much like Cabernet Franc should have a stalky note and it should be fresh red fruits and ... But you might be faced with other expressions, but you have to be open to that. And I think another thing with conventional wines, you have to think of law has a very significant impact in what you can call your wine. Like in terms of, like, you've got AOC regulations, which will put forward things like the yield at which you grow your grapes. Some will specify whether you handpick your grapes or not, that specific area that they come from, and they have to pass like tasting panels to like, so that it fits within what is typical for it to taste like. And sometimes you have to wonder, who decided that this is what it should taste like, and is it permanently going to be this way? And with we have like climate change, even half of the grapes that are grown where they are now, prospectively in the next 20 years, you may not be able to cultivate those grapes there. So are they all of a sudden going to have to change the law to say that now this is what the wine should taste like? This is now what's typical. So, you know, but then again, onto like tasting natural wines or low intervention wines. If you enjoy it, then it is good. and that's it. If you enjoy it, it is good. And in terms of ideas around the faults in a wine, everyone has different kind of tolerances for things. Some people say excessive breathiness, it might be excessive to you, but to people who are seasoned tasters, they love those kinds of earthier notes to things. And volatile acidity, again, it's a scale, what people can tolerate. So, you know, open mind, keep your mind open, be open to new experiences, enjoy the wine. And also, I think another thing is like the philosophy, the story. There's a lot to be said about the romance of the story, and you can really be invested in it and be taken in by that. And I know you can't kind of taste the philosophy, but when you meet these winemakers and you listen to what they have to say, you can't help but a bit of your like heart to kind of go out. So, you know, that's my approach, but each to their own.
So I would say, I mean, I guess we're, you know, answering whether it's, what's the difference, you know, between natural and conventional wines. And for me, the fundamental difference is this idea of aliveness. And when I was, you know, researching for the book and then writing the book, the really one thing that kept coming back is this word, you know, it's alive. And I think that is the fundamental love, you know, that natural wine brings, is this very idea, is the aliveness in the vineyard, you know, the fact that there is so biodiversity, whether it's biodiversity you can see flying around, roaming around, or the biodiversity that grows, all the different plants that will be, sprouting, in the vineyard, also underground, all these, microbugs, all this, life, which is really buzzing underground. And I think that's, when you have this aliveness in the vineyard, then you can have a real connection between the plant, between the minerals, between the soil structure. Then you can really talk about terroir. And I think terroir is a word that we use all the time, and we don't really think about actually what does terroir mean. But you cannot talk about terroir if you do not have a connection between the plant and the soil. And you can only have this connection if you're farming organically. So for me, that is the pillar of what natural wine is. And then you carry on with this idea of aliveness, in the cellar. So this microbiology, the yeast, the bacteria that are, on the grapes, in the soil, in the juice. When you bring the wine in, then there's the fermentation process that happens, and you keep that live. These bacteria, these yeasts, and then when you drink a bottle of natural wine that hasn't seen any sterile filtration or excessive use of sulfites or any use of sulfites, then you look at a wine under a microscope and there is actually physically, things happening, which doesn't happen in a conventional wine. And so what that means is that, obviously it's going to bring a different energy, it's going to bring a different taste profile to a wine which is, made following a certain recipe with sterile filtration from grapes that are literally dead. You cannot make wines with non-organic farming, I think, and that's that for me. That is really the idea behind natural wine. It is, like you say, Audrey, it is about a philosophy, absolutely, of production. It is, you have to really want to make natural wine, to make great natural wine, I think. And when you taste these wines, I think that the key thing for me is to not have any expectations, which is really hard, because as a human being, we have expectations about everything, the way, we look at the weather, and then we have in our head how we should be dressing, and, everything we do, everything we say is framed and based on expectations, and tasting wine is part of that. And the wine industry has been very good for the past 40, 50 years at developing technologies, that will frame wine in a very specific category, and have been very good at training us to have expectations. So I have an expectation as to what a Sauvignon Blanc is going to taste like. I have an expectation as to what a Pinot Noir is going to taste like. And so that's really hard. And I think that's the hardest thing, is to kind of get rid of that and approach wine like we do with food, because when you taste a piece of cheese, you don't have an expectation that it's going to have this very, very, very specific taste profile. And I catch myself, although not so much now, and I know we're going to talk more specifically about how we taste natural wine. But I realize that more and more, I really have I pour myself a glass of wine, and I have almost like a blank mind, I'm so excited to be tasting this wine and discovering maybe something new, or discovering a new dimension or a new flavor, or getting to know the grower a bit better. And I think that's the real challenge as a wine drinker or as a wine professional, is to just drop these expectations that we may have, because then I think then we can really be actually, discovering these wines for the first time, having in the background a whole set of, I'm not saying throw away, any ways of tasting technically or whatever. I'm not saying that at all, but I think the first step really is just to drop that expectation.
Yeah, and so I want you to just kind of get into more about, this idea of food pairing and what should taste good with what. I know, Dinkinish, she writes a lot about that in her work, but also like this for those of us who don't consider ourselves necessarily wine connoisseurs, but may consider ourselves foodies, right? And want something that it's like feels good to us, that is new, that provides us with an experience. Because one of the things that I hear you all saying is it's really about the experience. And so from everything from, like you said, how the fruit is grown to how it is cultivated, like all of those things matter, and really make up what we're talking about when we talk about natural wine, but also like the experience, right, with that, and not like getting into this habit of shaming or feeling like we should be tasting something. And if we don't taste it, then we're right. So I kind of want you all to talk about that, in terms of tasting and pairing foods and what that means, and palates.
So, I'm glad that you brought this up because, like I said earlier, for me, like, I came up in the culture where it's like foie gras and sauternes, prosciutto di Parma, wrapped melons with Sauvignon Blanc. It was very, that flavor wheel, it was very didactic and serious and clinical. And those are beautiful pairings. But I really wanted to explore wine in a way that was unique to my experience, right? So this whole idea of like fine dining and refined foods, like the way that we even reference foods. When we talk about French food and Italian food, there's almost a change in the tone of our voices. There's a reverence. There's a, this is the food to have with wine. And I thought to myself, well, I love my mother's food. I love my mother's curry goat and oxtail stew, like the vegan Caribbean chef around the corner. I love his food. I love Indian food. Like, I really wanted to explore the foods that made me feel a sense of home with wine. And when I was more focused, when I was more involved in the conventional wine experience, I was very it was like I was thinking of, okay, dark fruit notes are going to go great with like heavy stews and all of that. But what the natural wine transition has released me from is that sort of didactic way of thinking. Relax. My first, note to everyone is just taste the wine, and I feel like the wine will let you know. And it's not always going to be the same. Like, I had a Montepulciano di Abruzzo that typically I would never think of pairing with like jerk spice. So jerk spice, for those of you that don't know, it's like a combination of like sweet spices, and there's like a Scotch bonnet pepper, and it's like a rub, or it can be wet and you put it on meats, and you can put it on veggies too. I would never have thought to pair that with that type of spice, but it worked. So I think what Audrey was saying, and I think Isabelle said it also, is that for me, don't be afraid of trying things out. Yes, it's good to have a reference point, right? It's good to ask your sommelier or your local wine professional their suggestions, of course. But just know that if that person makes a recommendation and it doesn't speak to you, that there's nothing wrong with you. It just means that pairing didn't work and something else will.
Right. So in terms of kind of the classic pairings, yes, they exist for a reason, and a lot of things will, if you're like going for heavy red and then you have like a richer meat, yes, they'll probably go very well together. But one thing that I've realized when it comes to food and wine pairing is that there's not enough exploration of the fact that we are not all eating classic French or Italian dishes for dinner, like every day. A lot of the time I'll be eating a blend of things. Like when it comes to foods that are like of my heritage, my Ghanaian heritage, when I was trying to look for potentially good pairings, like nothing. Or it's usually, you should just have an off-dry white wine. And a lot of the time they do not pair well at all. It's just, you're just like, this is what they said would work, but it doesn't. And then you realize that the rules of wine pairing are only kind of hard and fast if you're within a particular parameter. But people are from other places of the world. The world is very big. So what you're eating is going to be different. And one thing I've found with especially like, I'm in London, so we are quite privileged here, but there's a lot of very like great kind of suppliers putting together very great portfolios of wines, and there are restaurants that are doing like exclusive like listings of just low intervention and natural wines, and these are being paired with like Pan-African cuisine, like just Pan-African cuisine, low intervention natural wines, and everything you try is just like, it's revelatory, you know? You're just like, someone actually thought that that, you know, you might be eating some egusi with spinach with some palm oil in there, and it might go with a cloudy Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. So it's just hard and fast pairings. Yes, they exist for a reason, but you've also got to bear in mind that there are a lot of other potential pairings and rules. Sometimes the door needs to be blown off the hinges. It just needs to blown off the hinges. Think broadly and you will find something. There are some kind of like, in terms of intensities, yes, you have to make sure that your food is not going to like drown out your wine. But then I think if you've got a lively enough acidity, you'll always be able to find the wine. And one thing I've like enjoyed about a lot of like low intervention natural wines is that you've got a lot of kind of freshness. And if you have more complex dishes, the freshness will just like alleviate that. It will cleanse the palate. So, you know, I think I've had quite positive experiences in that respect. So yes, that's all I would say on that matter.
So I have to say, I don't really, you know, I think more and more I just think about what wine do I want to drink, and I'm not really thinking about food and wine pairing that much these days. I just pick a bottle and then whatever will be type thing. It's more about what I want to drink and what I fancy eating, and I don't really it's gonna go or whatever, because I think if the wine is really excellent and delicious, then and you tend to taste it first. You know, normally it's quite a safe strategy. But I think maybe for me, I'd love to go back onto really, you know, tasting natural wine, because I think we've seen, you know, natural wine is, you know, is in this phase now, which is really exciting, where you know, more and more people are drinking it. We're making more and more of it, and then at the same time, it's quite a scary phase because people are, you know, it's such a trendy, let's say, you know, movement, style of wine. And so we've, you know, and you know, a lot of wines are sold on Instagram now if they've got a beautiful label, and if the color looks great, and a lot of bottles are being, you know, a lot of wine is being bottled in transparent bottles to showcase these, you know, vibrant oranges and yellows and pinks and reds. And I think it's, and that visual aspect is obviously really important. And also, you know, when you know, I think it's played a really big part in selling quite a lot of wine. I think there is a whole category of wine at the moment which is being forgotten a little bit. I would say that maybe the more serious, less shouty, less trendy natural wines, and I think that's a bit of a shame, because I think there are a lot of amazing natural wines that are not, you know, very well known or look very traditional, and therefore they're not so Instagrammable. And I think that's quite important to sort of, you know, talk about that. And the other aspect is for me, tasting natural wine, you know, is really about two different things. You know, there is that, you know, going back to the idea of aliveness, and there is this idea of, when I taste a natural wine personally, and most of the wines I taste will be in the context of maybe buying for, you know, a client, a restaurant, a shop, or for the fair, because I taste most of the wines that attend the event. So I get loads of samples sent every week. And so my first approach will be, do I like this wine? Will I drink this wine? You know, is this a wine that I'm going to put on one side and drink it, or am I going to pour it down the sink, which what happens to a lot of the samples that I receive. And that's a really big test. but then I think there's also another dimension to tasting natural wine, which for me is important, and maybe it comes from some, I guess, maybe from a bit of a brainwashing from the MW training. I don't know, but systematically when I taste a wine, and I only taste natural wine or so-called natural wine, but that's the only thing that I really taste, is I taste for terroir. So that when I taste the wine, I really look for. I'm really excited. I might discover a wine that shouts a great site, because a wine that really can translate a great site is a really thrilling experience. That complexity of aromas, that diversity of aromas, that texture in the palate, and the way the wine fills up, your entire palate. Is for me is a really an amazing experience, and that, and also that looking for viticulture. I think you can really taste the farming. I think when you taste the wine, what you call the finish, and that wateriness, or the way it's closed off, and there's so much more to come. Those are really important aspects, I think, to taste for. The balance, obviously, are all the elements in balance. We talk a bit about bread, we talk about some VA, we talk about, are all of these elements in balance, or maybe there is an issue with the winemaking, or is there a proper fault? I actually, I'm not a big fan of mousiness, but is it a mousiness because the wine has been bottled too early, or is it mousiness that is there to stay? And I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think it's really important when you taste a wine, which is what we all do, is really to think about the work that's gone into that bottle, and you can really taste the dedication of the farmer. And so that's how I taste natural wine. And a while ago, and Paola, one of my colleagues who's actually watching, hi Paola, today, said to me, do you have that thought process for every single wine? And actually I thought about it, and actually I do. It doesn't have to be like a very long moment, but I realize that every time I take a sip of wine, I actually really have a moment where I think about the farming, the terroir. Is it really alive? Is it, there's, all of these elements. And then I take another sip an hour later, and then I'll have that same thought. It might be a 10-second process, because I am interested in the, in the evolution of the wine. And then the next day I'll taste the same wine, and I'll have, how is that being open for a day or two? Because actually with natural wine, I find that oxygen, if the wine is stable, if the wine was bottled ready to be drunk, rather than bottled with an expectation you're going to keep that wine for a few months without opening it, which is another debate, I guess, for the use of sulfites or no sulfites. But if that wine has been bottled, ready, really ready to drink, and then you leave it open, even in the glass, for a day or 2 days, a week. I've done it. I've done experiments over 3 months. I've drunk a bottle of wine, and it's really amazing how stable, how alive, how magical, the wine is. So I guess there is this, I guess my point is that it's really important to taste. I mean, I'm a big central drinker. I taste with my gut, I taste with my mouth. I don't score wines anymore. I'm very immediate. I'm very instinctive initially, and then there is this kind of process also going on in the background. And yeah. I just wanted to go back to tasting natural wine, because, in a way, I think, I'm really grateful of maybe some, of some of the, I guess, maybe technical training I've had, even though I think sometimes it kind of really frames you, and then you're looking for faults when they're not there. So you have to kind of undo a lot of that. But, I think it's really interesting to really think about all these details, and that intensity, and that concentration of flavors, that texture. Is it from the fruit, which I think with natural wine, a lot of it is, because people are not so hell-bent on adding, flavorings with oak or anything like that, and excessive tannins maybe from wood. So the tannic texture tends to be a lot more fruit-driven and a lot more fine in grain. And I think, again, texture for me plays a big part in when I taste natural wine. The consistency, the fact it's not been fined or filtered, the fact that there's no malolactic fermentation, so obviously you get, slightly creamier mouthfeel. All of that I think are really, for me anyway, it's just, it's like part of my process of when I taste a wine. And I do, and then it's not just about a very intellectual exercise. There's obviously a lot of pleasure in there, absolutely. But yeah,
thank you. Yeah, I had a question. I see a question from Sarah that says, Dinkinish, what do you think about when you try natural wine? And I also want to, just before you answer that, just kind of touch on some of the things you all talked about, because all of that really resonated, I know probably with so many of us. But when I was thinking of, as all of you were talking, what it sounded like to me is we're talking about experiencing one, not just tasting, but experiencing natural wine, but then also as tasting natural wine really as a culturally relevant experience, right? And making sure that we include, right, folks in this experience, right? Because it's something like a lot of different industries, we have movements and we have things that take off and are popular, but then we exclude folks, right, who should be part of the conversation, who should be part of the experience. And so, Dinkinish, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that just was really resonating with me in terms of how you all were talking about this idea of tasting natural wine. And as we were talking, with Pamela and some of the other folks that are part of Vanguard, we're talking about equity, right? We're talking about inclusion. We're talking about shifting the culture in the wine industry, right? And natural wine is a part of that industry, right? So of course we have to start thinking about, right, this experience in natural wine. I don't know if you would call it a movement or the philosophy, right, as a culturally relevant experience that really includes a number of folks who can relate, so all of us can relate to that. So just wanted to throw that out there.
So I'm going to answer Sarah's question. Hi, Sarah. But Isabelle touched on so many things, so many words that I just kind of wanted to bring up: aliveness, energy, sensuality, the process, terroir. So I think for all of us who drink wine as a lifestyle, there's always that bottle that's kind of like an aha moment. So for me, the Villalobos Carmenere and the Carignan from Chile, I remember having that and I was like, oh, this is terroir. I could smell the flora. I could smell, like I read that the family discovered some land that had vines that were like over a century old or something like that. If I'm a little off, guys, don't come for me. I might be a little wrong about the age of the vine. But, making the decision to not, prune and manicure, like, what's the word I'm looking for? You know what I'm saying? To clean it up, right? They made the decision to just allow the vines to exist as themselves wildly. And I remember that experience being captured in the wine. And like there was a funk, there was a smell of, wild, like gamey animals, goats roaming through the mountains, mangoes bursting in the summertime in the grass in Miami. So Sarah, I'm answering your question. When I'm tasting any wine, to be honest with you, whether it's been actually categorized as natural or not, I'm looking for an experience that's going to bring me home to like stillness, enable me to be here in this moment. Because for all of us, if you have a very busy life, there's just something about wine that centers you meditatively. It can, just like a yoga practice would. And that's why, you know, it's a thing. You know, when I'm having my wine moments, guys, it is a thing. You know, I might have candles burning, like it's a moment. It might as well be a dude in the room. You know what I mean? Like it's a thing because I have so much going on in my little world. And with natural wine, I've just learned to be open. Yesterday or a couple days ago, I had a wine from Mexico. I can't remember the name. Beachy, I think is the name of the wine. Beachy. And oh my gosh, I was sitting in the park. Yes, I was drinking illegally at the park. Oh my God, this is being recorded. Sorry. But I remember opening that bottle and immediately, you know, being transported to these fresh. Then I wanted barbecue. I wanted arroz con pollo or rice and beans. Like, so my point is when I'm tasting wine, it's kind of like for those of you who like go to church or some type of spiritual thing, right? You have to go in there with the attitude of receiving. You know what I mean? Like if you go in with an attitude that's closed and you've already made up your mind that this is, you know, what this is supposed to be, you might be disappointed. But if you can just let go and relax and allow the wine to do its thing, it can be beautiful. That's why I really wanted to touch on the words that Isabelle used, because those words are not just about the wine, it's also about the attitude that you bring to the wine.
And feel free to add anyone. No, I think that was amazing. Yeah, feel free to add to that. No one is telling anything here. This is a safe space. Yes, this is being recorded, but it's all good. Audrey.
Dink, just hearing you talk about wine, it's like I want to taste with you. I want to know what it is you're actually drinking because I must be.
Come on, let's hang out.
Yeah. I am definitely not drinking the same things, but I think, yeah, sometimes you forget that. Well, not that you would forget, but wine is drinking wine is a pleasurable experience, and I feel that sometimes because I drink like conventional wines and natural wines, that sometimes the fun can easily be sucked out of it because of, you know, studies and assessment and whatever else, and you're surrounded by very like a lot of people who might be collectors of wine, and they have very kind of classical palates, and they might be buying wine for like aging. They have very extensive and expensive cellars, and you're just like, this yeah, it's not it's not my life. So it's kind of your experiences are different, but you know, wine is to be savored and enjoyed with good company. The company makes a big difference. So that too, that's all I will say.
I think, I mean, it's almost like we need to sit with that. We need to have that experience sink in. So I agree with the company, Audrey, because folks will tell you, right, like anything else, when you're around certain folks and they have expectations, sometimes they push that off on you, or they tell you, for those of us who might be more experienced, they tell you, oh, it should taste like this, or you should, you know, pair with this, and this is good. So I appreciate you all for just, you know, really encouraging us to lean into that, to the experience, first of all. And so one of the things that you all mentioned too is just really how the natural wine philosophy is growing, right, in the terms of being a movement within the industry. So I really want you all to also share with us some of the challenges around or barriers related to natural wine in terms of like production, and maybe consumer accessibility. I know, Audrey, when I met with you, you were telling me so many great things and kind of schooling me on natural wine and how, you know, sometimes we put things out here, but they're not necessarily accessible to everyone, right? We say, oh, come share in this, come be a part of this, but they're not necessarily accessible. So if you all can talk about that, that would be great.
See, I think one thing you have to bear in mind is cost. That I've realized that when it comes to a lot of lower intervention wines, they cost more money. And I think if you, like, when you look into the work that goes into it, of course it's going to cost more money. But in terms of people being willing to pay a premium, I think one thing you have to bear in mind is that we're all involved in wine, or like love wine. So what we know and what we're willing to spend on a wine is like considerably more than other people. I know a lot of people are just like, if a wine costs more than £10, then it's too expensive, or at that cost, if it surpasses like the £15 mark, the wine needs to be outstanding. And you're just like, well, it doesn't always, it's not necessarily going to be the case. But I think people who already have an interest are very kind of, they'll be open to this, or people who have tried kind of low intervention wines and enjoy them will be open. But also I think an issue is kind of the co-opting of the word natural, and because it's been associated with a style more so than a philosophy, and kind of not so much the winemaking, depending on the circles, you find that everyone is very eager to put their wine forward as being a natural product. Yes, it's made from grapes, but there's a lack of, I think, clarity a lot of the time with all wines. It's kind of, if you were to say to someone will say, oh, that they're vegan, but then you tell them that the wine that they're drinking actually may contain casein, may contain casein, it may contain isinglass. At no point is this actually made clear on the labeling. Like, no one is any the wiser about what actually goes into conventional wines. They're not labeled either. And I think that now there's more of kind of a move towards the certification of natural wines. I know that in France there's a new kind of like certification. I think if someone is making like low intervention wines and they have to put on labels and have some certification, why aren't conventional wines like similarly kind of encouraged to have more clarity? Because I think what happens is that there can be not a confusion, but you have an image that is always put forward as pastoral. You have the nature and the hills and the vines like languishing under the sunshine, and everyone's just like, this like grapes into wine, it's just this very like easy transition, and it's not. So I think in terms of accessibility, like wine generally has an accessibility problem because there's a lot of mystery. And then even when you want to learn more, there's like, it's not easy. I think wine is complicated. No one is going to tell you otherwise. And the more you know, it seems the less that you know. But if you're a consumer, it's just a minefield, And even as someone who studies wines, for me, sometimes I'm just like, what? What? So I think accessibility in terms of like, there's accessibility issues in regards to knowledge, there's accessibility issues in regards to cost. There's a lot. And I don't know what needs to be done better or differently in order to bring people in, or make things like not necessarily easier to understand, but just to engage people. And I think engagement is somewhere where I think that wine as an area has struggled in comparison to like other drinks categories. So yes, that's all from me.
I would say that, like you pointed out, Audrey, is for me the lack of transparency in the drinks industry in general, I think is one of our greatest problem, because you know, if you go out on the street wherever you live right now and ask how is wine made, you know, people will say it's just grape juice, right? And that's the vast majority of people. So there is this huge gap between what people believe a wine is and what a wine actually is. And I think if we could, you know, if we could see ingredient labeling coming on board, that would be a big help. And I think people would then start realizing that there are different types of wine. And I think then it would be a lot easier to communicate to people maybe why a certain wine is going to cost much more money, or more money, if that, because actually I think it depends also where you live in terms of the cost of natural wine. If they're in the US or in the UK, it's very different to being in France or in Spain. And the idea that, you know, we have this idea that alcohol should be really cheap, and that alcohol doesn't cost anything. And it's the same with food. You know, we have this idea that food shouldn't really cost very much. And in fact, if you look at our spend on food now compared to many years ago, we're spending less and less on food. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of maybe drinking less, maybe drinking better. I think is an important message that I really try and communicate, because it's, you know, if you drink a really good glass, maybe it will cost you less than a very cheap bottle of something bad. But I think what the industry as at large is suffering from is also this use of buzzwords. You know, we love latching on to sustainability, but actually, have we really thought about what does sustainability mean? You know, what it is to be sustainable. You know, craft spirits, craft beer. If you know, the natural wine movement is following on to obviously the food movement, and we all know that, you know, the rise of sourdough bread and these very, you know, craft sort of foods and real food, you know, is becoming, you know, when now is mainstream. But, you know, sourdough bread 20 years ago was very hard to come by on a commercial level. And I guess natural wine followed on the footsteps, and looking ahead, if you have buzzwords like craft spirits, but then you also distill you know, apart from these foraged ingredients that make it on the front of your label, you know, what did you use as a base spirit? I mean, I had the case many times of people who want to come to the fair, and I ask them how is the base spirit made, or what's the key ingredient? Is it organic? And actually they don't know, because they just bought it from Austria. It was, you know, but then they used, you know, wild foraged juniper berries, and then suddenly it's a craft gin. And I think, I guess the point I'm trying to get at is, I think I'm really up for regulation. I think what's happening in France is interesting with the methods, you know, méthode naturelle, and more growers are into the idea. I think we should really say what is a natural wine, and have at least some key aspects, even if it just includes, you know, the wild fermentation, you know, clean farming, organic farming. What is a craft beer? You know, people think a craft beer is like a homemade beverage, but actually, you know, it can be made in millions of cans and still be a craft beer. Craft gin can be made without using any organic ingredients, and you know, so I think we have a long way to go, because we love using these words, because it makes it so easy to sell a handcrafted gin that it is to sell, you know, something maybe more generic sounding, or a natural wine than a non-natural wine. So I think for me it's about us as an industry maybe being responsible about the way we use certain words, because I think even professionals, we call a natural wine without necessarily actually finding out, and I'm sure, you know, and I may have done the same unknowingly. But you know, I try and have as much information as possible before I can say this is a natural winery, you know, but it's not foolproof. But maybe to try and find out more about the farming, the winemaking process, you know, before we call it a certain thing. And I think sort of this transparency, but this transparency is hard, you know, when we put on the fair raw wine, I ask growers to send us, you know, analysis, so I know exactly how much sulfites are in the wine, and we declare that, and we're very transparent about that. But that That's quite unusual. It's very hard to actually find information, on the internet about how wine has been made, unless you call the grower and then you can find out. So I would say, for me, this idea of transparency is really important. And then I think the last thing I'll say is that I think, what we're doing is for me, the context of natural wine is about changing viticulture. I think that's what's really important. And I think that's what we can all do, by drinking more natural wine, by talking about it, by inspiring more and more drinkers to drink natural wine from grapes that are grown organically. It means we can actually have a go at changing the viticulture. Only 5, 6, 7% of the world vineyards are farmed organically. I mean, that's appalling. Particularly when you look at places like, I don't know, Chile, or even places in California. I mean, not everywhere in California, but where it should be quite doable to farm organically. And so I think natural wine is such an amazing way to touch a lot of people and also have a sensitivity towards the environmental issues around farming. And that's, I guess for me, that's why I always go back to when I taste natural wine. It's really about tasting, trying and think about the farming and, and what can we do? How can we inspire people to fall in love with the landscape, with walking around in the vineyards through a glass of wine, and therefore having people to care more and more about the environment. And when they go to a winery, ask questions. Go to the vineyard. How many people how many of my friends go to a winery and I say, well, what did the vines look like? They say, well, I don't know. We just sat in the tasting room. We need to change that. We need to really get people out there walking in the vines and knowing to recognize when there is biodiversity, when there's no biodiversity. And I think natural wine, because it's so catching, because it is, selling and people are so into it, particularly, I would say, younger people. I'm getting older now, but I think we have, it's such an amazing stage. And at the same time, it's a very frightening stage because it is a buzzword, and we're, a lot of people want to make natural wine, even though they're not farming organically, they don't use the natural yeast population and all of that. So I think it's the waters to navigate are really tricky, I personally think. But it's also, if you think back 15 years ago or 20 years ago, some of the very big names nowadays, where you can only get one bottle allocation if you're lucky, struggled to sell their wines back then. The journey has been really quick, incredibly so. And now I think it's quite straightforward or easy, a lot easier as a young or not so young person to set up. And I know, Megan, you're there from Margins Wine. You can talk about your experience, like as a young grower or somebody who's starting up. I think the market is there. People want the wine, and that's such an amazing position to be in. And I think for me, we're at a very exciting time, even if we have to deal with wannabe natural wines or people who want to jump on the bandwagon, of course. But still, it means we have a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Isabelle. Yeah, also a couple things. You all talked about trends, and I want to get back to this idea because when you were talking, I was thinking about all with foods like the farm to table movement and this clean eating and raw wine and all these other things. And so really, I want if you all can talk about how this relates to the popularization of natural wine and this idea of conscious wine culture, right? Because you mentioned also buzzwords. And so we know for other industries, we know that social justice, if we can be real about it, right, is a buzzword. We know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are all buzzwords right now. The folks are trying to stamp on their labels. They're trying to stamp on their websites, put in their missions, etc. And so if you all, would just talk a little bit about this idea of this conscious wine culture. Something that Dinkinish said in one of her articles was that, socially, Socially, the way of experiencing wine is becoming different, right? It's changing. And so what does that mean, right? Because we talk about viticulture, we talk about viticulture, but when we talk about just culture and wine, what does that mean that the old way of experiencing wine is dying? Any of you?
So, in the article that you're referencing, I was talking about the fact that, well, actually, the article, so I wrote this article for the Miami Herald for Black History Month, right before the murder of George Floyd. And all of a sudden, once that video was seen all over the world, I was getting DM'd. It was very save your local Black person type of vibe. And people were being called out in the wine industry for being racist. And it was such a surreal moment. I don't know if anybody here knows Julia Coney, but she did an Instagram live and it was like church. She started to speak viscerally of the ways that she had been alienated and disrespected in her career. And for me, as someone who has been, you'll mention, I'll write an article about racism, but to be totally honest with you, I'm like, I don't want to not get invited to a wine tour, to a press junket, because there goes that angry Black woman. We don't want So it to see that now we can have these conversations openly is kind of amazing. Now, having said that, when we're talking about inclusion, and that's great and wonderful, but we also need to talk about the economic empowerment of men and women from diverse communities that have been contributing to the wine industry, working hard and not being properly compensated for what they do. Do you understand what I'm saying? So yes, we're having uncomfortable conversations, but we need to get past that. We need to move forward. We need to make sure that not only are we including, in terms of mentioning and tagging, that's great, that's wonderful, but are we really interested in an egalitarian society in this culture? Because that's something else. So that's how the conversation is changing. For me personally, 15 years ago, it was unfathomable to have like a really direct, honest conversation with a white person in the industry about racism. I just wouldn't do it. I'd be too scared. And to know that there are conscious white people reaching out and saying, we want to have this conversation. We know this is fucked up and we want to move forward. What can we do? I think that's beautiful. And I just hope that we can just continue to move forward. Uh-oh.
No, I think there was in the wine space in the UK as well. There's been like a bit of a not, I wouldn't say it's a massive reckoning, but it was just until I kind of like started working in a restaurant, like no one actually realized that there were very few kind of people who look like me working front of house and do anything related to wine. And people were shocked. They're just like, you know about wine? I'm like, yeah. And it's only very, very kind of recently that any attention has been paid to the lack. And it really kind of, I think it starts to become quite disturbing when you think when you realize that the lack of participation, no one noticed, or that no one said anything about it. And then it was all of a sudden, everyone's like, yeah, I realized this 10 years ago. I'm like, well, where was, where were you saying the things about this? No one was saying anything. And I think in terms of even when you think of like vineyard work, because Dinkinish, I was reading your article, and I think a lot of people don't tend to acknowledge that there are a lot of people doing physical labor in vineyards who are brown people, and very little attention is paid to the welfare of people working this way. And then when it comes down to kind of like less usage of pesticides in kind of plants and everything, you think, okay, who are the people who are actually going to be affected if there's adverse health effects when it comes to being in these vineyards? It's brown people. And I think that is another conversation that needs to be like highlighted more. But are people ready to have kind of an extended continuation and a continued dialogue with these things? Because I think what tends to happen is that it's not even about being performative. I think people want to say the right thing or be like look like they're doing the right thing. And I think some people are like very serious about equity and putting in the effort and like creating next steps. And there's a few kind of scholarships, other programs like mentorship as well. But I think at a kind of like base level, people aren't looking deeply enough, especially I think when it comes to work in the vineyard and who's going to be adversely affected. And even when it comes to things like chemical runoff and degraded soil, sometimes, yeah. But who's ready for that conversation, and how is it going to be facilitated? Because I think it's one thing for us to be talking about it, but people who actually have more power to impact change, if they're not talking about it, I don't think that anything will change significantly in the long run. What will happen is that 20 years will pass, and then there'll be another shocking incident, and then all of a sudden people are kind of like, oh, we must do something. And then all of us will say, this happened exactly 20 years ago and nothing has changed. So what are the next steps, and what can we actually do in terms of inclusion, not just in a forward facing aspect in terms of representation, but also to other voices that you don't tend to kind of hear either. But I don't have the answers, but just wanted to say my piece.
I just wanted to say something just to speak to Audrey's point, that we need to be in the natural wine, in the conscious wine culture. Conscious wine is something that I created so that it's like an umbrella term. So all of those things, biodynamic, natural, we have an umbrella term. But we need to be as excited about humanity as we are viticulture. So we need to be excited about the ones who do the picking and the pruning and the writing, and we need to be as concerned about that as we do the environment. Because if somebody who's picking the grapes is experiencing dehumanization as a spiritual person, I feel like that energy goes into the grape, and it does go into the soil, right? Well, I may not taste it, but as a spiritual person, I just feel like things come full circle. So that's what I want to see. I want to see us get as excited about humanity as we are the viticulture.
And I think, for us, I know, Audrey, you're also based in the UK, in Europe, I think we also have a lot to learn from what's happening in the US. I think at the moment people are a lot more comfortable, speaking about their experiences, speaking out. I think there is a bit of a silence going on at the moment in our industry. And for me, I find it very inspiring, the strength which is coming out of many people in our community, in the wine community at large. I don't think the natural wine community is particularly, is a saint in that. I think there's a lot of issues, surrounding sexual harassment, racial issues, unfortunately. I wish the respect that we have for nature, was translated in a much deeper respect for our, I would say, brothers and sisters. And I think we have a lot to learn. When I speak to all my colleagues in the US about specific issues that come up, I find it very inspiring that there is a much more vocal movement, because the same issues are happening, obviously, over in the UK or in France, but we haven't reached that stage where people are starting to really, be a lot more vocal, and hopefully they will come soon. But I do think that, I find the whole conversations very inspiring in the US, and the work that Pamela is doing with the pledge also is really inspiring. We're looking as an organization. I've had some conversation with sometimes where maybe some incidents of people getting a bit drunk, feeling a bit uncomfortable, and how we can maybe even as Grow Wine, when we organize an event, how we can even try and make it a safe environment, how we can put, I don't know, text in place, or at least be aware that even though we are in a very small community, that we're not, I guess, we're not safe from issues, and I think we need to learn a lot more. The UK, France, Europe, we need to learn a lot more from what's going on in the US. That's for sure.
Yeah, as a consumer, I speak for myself and saying, like, I want to know these things, right? When I'm seeing something that says natural wine and says sustainable, I want to know these things, right? I want to know that it's not for show, right? It's not for Insta. It's not because you just want my money. And I think a lot of people are feeling like that. Jess, you brought up a good point in the chat. Yes, who makes up our industry? And who do we see making up? Who do we see as making up our industry? And so the idea between, like, what is it? What is the picture show, and what is it really? And so, there's been a disconnect for sure in terms of wine culture, because for many of us, right, we're sitting here having this conversation, and as Pamela has brought up many times in our meetings, like, we're having this conversation and we're approaching it this way because when we think about who makes up wine culture, right, we all pretty much have the same image, right? We pretty much have a certain class associated. We have a certain gender. We have a certain, white male, upper middle class kind of group of people, right, that make up or that we associate with wine culture. And so how do we begin to change that? There are a lot of things that you all touched on that I think are great. And I think that also, just help us understand, like, what is going to keep the natural wine, this philosophy or this movement, from becoming just another, like, woke movement, right? For becoming another trend. And you kind of maybe touched on it in terms of, like, continuing to have these conversations as many times as we need to have them. But what else? Like, what is the role of consumers, of makers, of industry partners in this? And making sure this is just not a trend that 15 years down the line, someone said, you're like, oh yeah, we talked about it. And that was cool, but now we're on to something else. And so please enlighten us.
I think one of the things to do is also be a lot more, I mean, if we're talking about the natural wine and even just like from a production perspective, I think even just really having conversations with producers and understand, the production process, understand what's happening in the vineyard, I think maybe having more transparency around who works in the vineyard, maybe asking questions about actually how much do people get paid and what are, I think there is a little bit of that idea that, or somebody is classified as a natural wine producers, therefore, they are exempt from, trying to find out more how they treat their people who work with them. And I think maybe having some more open conversation so it feels more normal, I think is always a good way. It's just like talking about, you know, the winemaking. So it's a sort of, now it just becomes a conversation. And I think this is something that we've never really touched on in the past. And I think there is an opportunity now, particularly with, you know, some of the recent events, you know, we've seen with some producers accused of, you know, mistreating their team. And I think very simply having these kind of conversations, they shouldn't be taboo. You know, we should be able to actually feel like it's okay to check that producers are really being, you know, looking after the well-being of the, you know, of everyone. And I think well-being for me is a very important term in natural wine. You know, the well-being of the planet, the well-being of the plants and the animals and the insects, and the well-being of the people who are working with the farmers. And I would say that from having visited a lot of farms, I think by and large, the well-being is a big aspect of the farmer, but the issue is when you start also maybe buying fruit, you're not necessarily sure how that vineyard is being handled. You're not really sure actually who's doing the work or how they're being paid, and maybe there just needs to be open conversation about that, and feel that we're more free, and that it's okay to say, you know, actually, how much are your staff being paid, and what kind of benefits do they have? And I know particularly in the US with, you know, health being such a big issue, health cover. So maybe just opening up the conversations would be a good place to start.
I just wanted to say, you know, let us move with grace. When you're talking to people about their product and what they're doing, we definitely don't want to be accusatory. We definitely don't want to be judgmental, because the reality is that there are people who have been making wine for generations that don't use these terms like biodynamic and all of that, but they are creating low intervention wines, and have been. You know what I'm saying? And just don't feel the need to market themselves in that way. That's just who they are. I recently was in a similar space like this, and I used a term that I guess was no bueno. And all of a sudden it was like, boop, 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 like it was just like, you know, it was all of these attacks against me and the term that I was using. And I thought, oh my goodness, calm down, you know? And there's a lot of rushes to judgment, I think, on the online space, you know, in social media communities, we're quick to hang one another. And I feel like we need to just relax. You know, if you're talking to somebody about what they're doing and how they're doing, I feel like it's important to move with grace, you know, and to listen and make sure you know what you're talking about before you approach people. Does that make sense to everybody? Because all of these rushes to judgment, I think, and sort of moving aggressively and attacking one another, that just sort of defeats the purpose of moving forward. You know? Yeah. That's all.
See, it's a tough one, because I think when it comes to what I've over this pandemic, I think that there has been like genuinely a huge shift in people's consciousness. It's like for the first time, well, unless you're like a key worker and you've been rushed off your feet for the entirety of this time, people have had no other distractions. Like they've had to kind of sit down and think about things. And the amount of information that has been put forward is a lot more, and they've been able to like more consciously engage with information. And I think it's important that now, while people are kind of prepped and ready to receive, it just needs to continue. You need to well, not bombard people with kind of more relevant information, but if there are things that you can ways that you can bring awareness to issues. I think we just need to continue conversing. We need to continue talking, bringing issues to people who have some influence and can have an impact somewhere. But then again, what you're dealing with is, are people ready and do they care? And I think it's one thing to want to shift a culture, but if people do not want to engage and they don't care, there is nothing you can do about that. like genuinely, you cannot convince someone of something that they don't believe in. But I think slowly but surely, if conversations are kept going and you talk more about, even I think one way, I think in terms of how kind of low intervention, winemaking, grape growing has been able to influence the culture as a whole, is that, the land itself, in order for it to actually to continue to produce anything, it actually needs to be looked after. You actually need biodiversity, and to be able to say that if you don't do this, you will not have anything. Quite literally, you can't build on a foundation that is barren dust. So I think hopefully, in terms of people who are kind of more inclined towards sustainable winemaking, the influence will spread. And it's already, I think, happening with kind of more, well, is it necessarily a good thing? And is it true that larger winemakers are thinking of converting to organics, or some winemakers that are already organic are trying to incorporate more biodynamic practices? There's a global trend towards trying to use kind of less chemical sprays and fertilizers, generally. So I think that's kind of a positive in terms of more so the land-based side. But in terms of diversity, equity, I think just keep the conversation going. And I think especially when it comes to just understanding that things don't just make themselves. I think wine generally, there needs to be a demystification that there are a lot of people involved, and you need to kind of bring the spotlight to the people who are not necessarily kind of looked at. And once people kind of see, they'll start to dig further, more exploration into the conditions of workers, and how is it that it has been kind of allowed to get so bad. And I think, just knowledge, learning, continuation, conversations, that's it.
It's funny because I know that, in all of their industries, as Pamela said, I'm a social justice educator, but we say the same things, right? To keep the conversation going. But one of the things that you all, that I thought I heard you all saying, is that we need to quite simply meet people where they're at, right? And not be so quick to condemn. And so I know, we're online and we're, watching things like Wine Fair, we're participating in panels and webinars and reading books, and a part of book clubs that are anti-racist and anti-sexist and all these anti-things, right? And suddenly we become experts, right? And so there are also then elders, right, in our communities and in our industries that have been doing this work for so long, right, and are not new, right? And Isabelle can speak to this, that whatever we call equity and inclusion and diversity, probably you've been working on that already, right? It's not new to you. And so we need to honor that, as a community, we have to be responsible for pulling people along, is what I think I hear you all saying. And as consumers, right, not rushing to that judgment and saying, what are you doing? How are you doing it? Why are you not doing this? Because there's so much that we may not understand, about the process, about their own challenges, and the fact that, even though it's not labeled, that was such an interesting fact, that even though it's not labeled, right, they might be doing all the right things that you would want them to do in order to shift culture, in order to ensure equity, and in order to ensure inclusion and diversity in terms of their production, in terms of access and all those good things. And so as we wrap up in a few minutes, I just want to leave you all with one last question. If you have questions to put in the chat, please do so. But quite frankly, why should we be excited about the future of natural wine?
Well, can I tell you that natural wine feels better in the body? Real talk. Like, this was one of the first things that I noticed when I transitioned. And it's a little tricky because you may drink a little bit more. You know, you may look at the bottle and be like, damn, it's almost done. But it just feels better in the body. Sometimes you're drinking a wine and it's just, it's heavy. It's weighing on you. You want to go to sleep. You still have work to do. That has been the number one thing that I've noticed, particularly with wines that are made biodynamically, that it's lighter, freer. Isabelle said it. It's more alive. It's more bright. You feel more elevated than you do tired. So that's something to consider, you guys.
Well, I think wine is interesting, exciting, pleasurable, and I think just at a base level, I think currently there's so much more kind of interesting, like now especially, like more interesting businesses that are kind of like have specific kind of low intervention focus. There's a really, really like great company called Little Wine. I think Christina Rasmussen, and it's like the excitement of the platform is just that it's kind of like, yes, the wines that she's chosen are delicious, of course, but then you have like insights into the winemaker's philosophy. There's all of these Q&As, there's lots of videos, and you know, it's almost like you're there yourself. And I think that's quite an exciting aspect within the low intervention area, that you have a lot of very interesting and excited and engaged like younger people who are bringing a lot of good projects forward. I think generally, even in terms of like trends in restaurants, like just more incorporation of like low intervention wines in restaurant lists, or what you'll have is like a restaurant that is just exclusively low intervention wines, and all of the wines are spectacular. Or if there's even a chance that there's something that people might not necessarily like it or get into it, they've even like put an asterisk next to it so you can read at the bottom that it may really like challenge you. So, you know, maybe this may not necessarily be the one that you should go for. But I think those are exciting things about the area, or for me, I think in London in particular.
For me, and I probably are going to start sounding like a broken record by now, but what I really love about natural wine is what's behind, you know, what's happening on the farm, on the land. I'm not so excited about the winemaking, and because I think the winemaking is a tiny proportion of even though it's the biggest story, really. I guess it's the most photogenic in a way, and you know what the bottle looks like, but it's actually how it's transforming the land, and how people who start farming organically get more and more into the idea of organic, and to watch that journey of how they care for the land initially, you know, by maybe not using certain products, but then by really introducing the biodiversity, how they bring back certain species, how they bring back, you know, planting trees. How that's really, for me, that's what has me hooked to natural wine, is being able to walk into a vineyard. I know that vineyard, you know, is really teeming with respect for nature. Nature is a bit of a, you know, is a bit of almost like a religion for me. You know, that I really admire the greater order. I really admire the chaos and the balance, you know, at the same time. And I think when you look at a really truly, I would say, organic, you know, clean or vineyard, is really inspiring. And I think that the smells, the energies in that vineyard is really something we need to strive for. And I really think that the growth of natural wine is an amazing opportunity to trickle back down and inspire more and more growers to go down that route, because that's the only way we can start maybe reversing, the erosion problem, the pollution problem, all of the climatic issues and so on. So for me, it's really what lies behind and that farm, that vineyard, that single vine, is what I love about natural wine.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. We're about out time, ready to wrap up, but I have really appreciated learning from all of you. And just hearing all of you speak so passionately and talk to us, for those who are connoisseurs and wine professionals, and those who are novice and consumers as myself. And so thank you all for attending as well. I want to thank again our sponsor, T. Edwards Wine, and also invite you all to the next panel at 11 o'clock. And I believe it is the Loire, past, present, and future. So please stay with us today and tomorrow. And again, you ladies are fabulous, and I look forward to hopefully having another opportunity to engage with you and work with you. Audrey and Isabelle, I'm just saying, if you give myself and Dinkinish your address, we might show up on your doorstep.
Why not? Why not?
Great pleasure.
Let's go to London.
Yeah. But
Bye, everyone who's joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, bye. Thank you for having us.